did you grow up playing in the Warhammer Fantasy Old World sandbox? Are you cautiously excited about the fact that Games Workshop are bringing it back? I mean, admittedly, they've not done the best job of keeping us informed about the thing ever since they announced it back in November 2019, but we're told that it's coming someday. And with that in mind, I thought I'd bring back my Warhammer Fantasy go-to guy, Nathan Stone, onto the show to talk about it. So let's kick things off by finding out Nathan's general overview of Warhammer the Old World so far.
Frustrating, I guess, would be the first word that comes to mind. And it's a good kind of frustration in a way. I'm really excited about it. I'm really happy that Games Workshop is going back to the old world, to the Warhammer world, and exploring a game that has a lot more possibilities and a lot of diehard fans that were kind of left in the dark after the whole thing blew up. So that's great. I have no problem with that. I am so stoked to see what comes out of this. I guess my issue has been I am very frustrated with the lack of communication between Games Workshop and fans from when it was announced, which now feels like a trillion years ago. And today we've had very few updates. There was a great one in the summer that answered some very basic questions about what kind of game it would be. And for the most part, it's going to be a Warhammer game from what we've understood. Square bases, rank and flank, the classic. But at the same time, there's a lot of hype and excitement that had been generated when they made this announcement, and generated by things like the ongoing success of Warhammer Total War that got a lot of us, and me especially, I'm a very excitable guy, really wanting more from Games Workshop here. And there's been this odd periods of darkness between these little snippets of information that were given, and they're so erratic and they're so strange that it almost feels like Games Workshop every now and then remembers that they're actually working on this, and they're like, oh yeah, throw a bone to the fantasy guys. Because we've had interesting tie-in articles about Kislev, and they're going to be in the old world whenever it comes out, and that was kind of around when they were teasing Kislev for Total War Warhammer 3, so it was a nice little tie-in. We've gotten just tiny little snippets of what some Kislev units might look like. They told us that some of the things that would be in Total War Warhammer were going to be in this new old world game. But they're basic questions about the game that we still don't know. They didn't answer anything about what the game was going to be until the summer of this year. And it's been really odd that they couldn't just make a little web page about Warhammer the Old World and throw up, some designs every now and again. Just give us like a developer's diary, all that kind of stuff that they're doing in the background, and they have to do in the background anyway. I just don't understand why it's so in the dark, this whole development cycle. And I understand there's been so many things that have gone on for Games Workshop. They've got COVID to deal with. They got Brexit to deal with. They got all sorts of stuff. The global supply mess that's gone on. I get it. And I understand that the game is probably delayed from when they thought it would come out now. I doubt we'll see anything probably this year, maybe even next year. I assume this is a large project that takes a lot of time, but just tell us, right? Just give us some information, because for guys like me and for a lot of the Warhammer lifers, we have our old editions, we have other games, we have everything that we kind of need, but there's something special about having an official living game to say, hey, look, if you're interested in this, try out, go to your local Games Workshop, go to your local hobby shop, pick up these things. It's so much easier than saying, well, I can provide you with, maybe a PDF of the old rules, and there's proxies and 3D printed models. It's that feeling of being supported in a game system that is really nice and really good for getting new blood into the hobby. And right now, there is a lot of people who have been saying, hey, I've been playing this Warhammer Total War game, or I've got friends that used to play the old fantasy, or maybe still do play the old fantasy. There is a market there, and they know that, and we know that. I just wish they would engage with this little market that is just dying for information and really wants to embrace this.
Yeah, you were saying on the on your own podcast, they don't even, and you mentioned it there, they don't even have a website for the thing, which is
No,
incredible.
it's wild. It's wild to think that in 2022 now, there's no dedicated website for Warhammer the Old World. And Games Workshop has thrown up websites for every conceivable thing under the sun before. Campaigns, they've done it for old like games that are no longer supported. Or this is basic stuff. And it's I don't want to say it's marketing 101. I'm not a marketer, but it just seems so obvious to me and so odd that you're not engaging an audience that desperately wants to give you money and wants to be engaged and wants to be drawn back into the warm clutches of the dragon that is Games Workshop, right? It's odd. I wish I had a reason for why any of this is happening, but I'm in the dark. And so all of the excitement that I have is kind of tinged by this secondary concerns of where is this game going? What is it going to look like? Because we just don't have those answers yet.
Yeah, so I suppose it's up to us to bring about a solution here, rather than us just complaining about it. What we're going to do is put ourselves in a hypothetical situation where one day, Nathan, you get an email or a phone call from somebody at Games Workshop, and they say to you, "Look, Nathan, big fan of the show, and we like the stuff you've been saying and stuff like that. So what we're going to do, we're going to offer you a job as overseer of the new Warhammer Old World project, and we're going to give you unlimited budget, unlimited resources, unquestioned authority." So you could come in and do what you like with this thing. And I know that's huge, but you're coming in the door. First couple of things you're thinking about, what are they?
Well, I mean, after graciously accepting this position, I will. I'll come in, probably, dressed up in some kind of homemade Chaos Warrior outfit.
It's the Heinrich Himmler hat you said.
I do. I really want my Heinrich Himmler hat. Maybe that's it. Maybe I'm going as the Lich Master into Games Workshop. That's going to be my official title too. Everyone's going to have to call me that, and they'll hate it. And so if I'm starting, and assuming that I am starting basically from scratch, the first thing I want to do is make sure that the game feels right. And it's not really something that you can quantify in a particular one particular sentence or that kind of thing, but I've kind of tried to break it down into what I think the game needs to be successful, both from a standpoint of new people finding the game and old guys like me just trying to relive the glory days of Warhammer Fantasy. So the first thing that popped to my mind is it needs to be immersive. It needs to be an immersive experience and the way that you can interact with this. And immersion's kind of a tricky one, and it's really a melding of rules, lore, and kind of attitude around the game. I think what you need, and we're as hobbyists, one of the things that I find, and it drives me crazy, but I can't call anyone out on it because I'm as guilty of it as anyone else is. We take all of this way too seriously. I mean, this is toy soldiers, and we should remember that from time to time. Nothing really matters as far as tournaments or hobby things. We give ourselves crazy hobby deadlines, or where we stress over painting models in a time frame, or just sometimes at all. And yeah, this is a silly game about fantasy toy soldiers. We should acknowledge that while also being respectful to the lore that has come before, and then the lore that we're going to develop in this game. And I liken it to wrapping yourself in a big blanket that is the Warhammer world. So there should be ways for people to engage with this in terms of lore from books, from Black Library, to diving into the mechanics of the game, to just loving the models. Right? There's this wonderful thing with Games Workshop games, and I think it's why people get so into them, is that because they're more than games, right? We spend way more time thinking about gaming for the most part, or thinking about hobbying, or just puttering around doing little things, than we ever spend, playing those high stakes games. And the reason why it's got so much real estate in our head is because we're able to live in those worlds. And I think you have to have that for a successful Warhammer game. You have to be able to do that. Old fantasy did that really well, and I just want to make sure that this new fantasy, the old world, does that as well. The second thing is it needs to be accessible. And by that, I mean accessible from a rules standpoint. One of the biggest complaints I have about Games Workshop games today is that I can look at a war scroll for Age of Sigmar, or I think it's called a data slate or data sheet for 40K, and I can see the stats of the unit, and I can see their special rules, but I don't really know what the unit does or can do until you start adding layers and layers of rules on top of that, from army rules, detachment rules, character rules, rerolls, auras. There's so much there that, while I don't think any of them are a bad idea singularly, I think where they've really gone off the rails is by stacking all of these things on top of each other. All of these rules make it exhausting to try and play, or try to get a grasp of these new additions. And maybe I'm just an old man and my brain just doesn't work anymore, but I really find it a struggle to get motivated to do anything in kind of the new realms of Games Workshop games, because of this lack of accessibility that I find as far as the rules go. The second way I mean accessibility is that this has to be a game that a kid can at least play to a basic level. I would never have gotten into this game if my friend hadn't found this. We were 8 when he found this. I was 9 by the time I got the game myself. We didn't play it right, not really, but we played it well enough, Warhammer Fantasy, and that's so important because, like cigarettes, you got to hook them while they're young. Adults might find and get into Warhammer, and I'm sure they do all the time. But like the kids, you grow up with a game like this in a world like this, these incredible spaces, and they just take over your brain like a drug. And here I am, as a 34-year-old, still talking about the stuff I loved then, and I think that's so important. They always say kids are the future, and I suppose that is literally the case. So you gotta, for the health of the game, down generations. I want to see people playing this in 2100. I'll be dead, but my ghost will see them playing this, and I'll have a big ghostly smile on my face. The last the last one is authenticity. It's just gotta be. It's got to feel like Warhammer when you play it and when you interact with it. This is a version of Warhammer Fantasy that they have told us is they're taking the best rules from 3rd to 8th edition. If that's the case, I got to see it. I got to see those classic stat blocks. I got to, when I put my armies down on the table, they have to look like Warhammer armies. That's kind of what I mean by authenticity. And I think those things kind of constitute the very first, like, that feel of the game. And if you nail those, that is a good foundation for your game, your house to be built on, as far as getting these things together. So in 1,000 or 20,000 words, that is the very first thing I would do.
That's good, sitting down at your first meeting, just laying down the law. to everyone. And also, you've sacked all the people that work there. Not that they're probably all great at their job, but you've just brought in loads of people who were around in like the 90s and that.
That's it. I'm
And
gonna hit up the Facebook groups and
look outside. There's just loads of snotling pump wagons parked outside. So I like what you're saying there about the generational thing. So I think it was the episode I did with Josh about we were looking over my first White Dwarf magazine, which was late '93, and I was saying on some of the photos I noticed, in store Games Workshop photos, it was loads of kids. You're talking maybe 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, and I'm never in Games Workshop stores now, but I don't know that it would be like that now. And the few times I've been in there, it's your more cliched kind of Games Workshop player. Your guy with a beard hiding away in the corner in the dark. So I don't know that they're those vibrant, sort of child-friendly places they once were.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I can't speak to it, I think, any more than you can about what goes on at the Games Workshop stores. I do try to avoid them. There's only one of them in Halifax where I live, so it's pretty easy to just not go in there. But even when I was first finding it as a kid, yeah, that was it. Like, this was back in '96, and I would go in Toronto to there was a Games Workshop. It wasn't the closest one, but it was kind of a day trip. So sometimes my mom would take me out into the city, and we'd go to the Games Workshop at the Eaton Center, which is just a really big mall in downtown. And it would be packed with kids either my age or usually like a little older, kind of the 10 to 13 set. And they would just be everywhere, right? And parents would just leave their kids there to kind of babysit them while they did some shopping elsewhere in the mall. And my mom did the same thing, actually, so I can't badmouth that at all. But yeah, and that was it. We would play on the little demo game tables as kids, and it was like this magical toy store that probably didn't want you calling it toys, but that's what they are, and that's what they were back then. And I do worry about accessibility for the miniature hobby in general, specifically Games Workshop, because the cliche thing is to complain about prices, and we certainly can, but there's not always a good way to access Games Workshop games anymore. Do you remember when you were a kid, they would have had, I mean, they still have these, but they, again, like, the prices have gone up and everything. There used to be super cheap little paint sets that would come with like a Chaos Warrior and a Space Marine.
Yeah,
and yeah, that was the first models I ever owned, was that little paint set, because I was still saving up for the big starter box. And yeah, those were wildly cool, I thought. And I don't know if it was more than $8 back in the day. And it was so cheap and it was so easy. And yeah, I wish I had a better answer, but it is something that worries me about that, because I would hate to see a generation kind of go without these games. And it as far as long-term health goes, I think you need that influx of young players, that really new blood kind of thing.
And yeah, not to dwell on this aspect of the conversation too much, but these days they're competing with so much. Kids' attention is so pulled towards. You've got top of the range video games and the internet and phones, so it is much harder, because this isn't an immediate gratification hobby. You've got to go in, collect your things, glue them up, paint them. This is very long tail, and I worry that a lot of young folk just don't have the patience to get involved in something like that now.
You've got a good point. I can't say that for sure that I would have found this hobby and fallen in love with it in the same way if I had grown up in modern times, or even like the 2000s, because there is things like video games, which, I lost hundreds and hundreds of hours to as a teenager, but by that point I had kind of had that that infection of Warhammer in my brain, so it never left.
Mm-hmm.
But if I had found that maybe later in life, maybe I only graze the hobby, or maybe I'm just like, oh, that's cool, maybe I'll try that someday, but I never get into it. I think you're onto something with that, because there is so many distractions, there's so many things, and I just wonder how many kids have the experience nowadays of doing something like making a model kit with a family member, or that kind of thing, because I did that as a kid, and it was kind of a gateway thing with Warhammer, because I at least had the context of, oh, I know what model building is, right? I made a few army planes and those kind of things. And yeah, it's odd, because we're such a tiny niche as a community. The whole war games community, when you put it all together, is such a tiny niche, and it's only a certain type of personality that really connects with it. A lot of people will try it out, certainly. They'll get the starter boxes, they'll do a little thing, and then 8 months, 2 years later, it's been forgotten in a box in the closet until they sell it. And I think if you're a company like Games Workshop, or whoever, is in this modern day of infinite distraction and everything goes so fast, how do you get people to slow down for a hobby? And I wish I had an answer to that, other than the fact that, like, for guys like us, it's very fulfilling. But we also grew up with it. And yeah, that's the thing. If you haven't grown up with it, if you haven't done these things since childhood, is that going to have make those same connections in your brain? Are you going to be able to just zone out and do a little painting, or read a little lore, or God forbid, have a game? I know I don't have games anymore. I assume people have games, but not me. Um, yeah, it's wild. It's concerning, and it's something that I do hope kind of works itself out. I do hope that with the exposure that Games Workshop's gotten over the last few years, that they're able to bring people into the wargaming hobby. And Games Workshop's always great, because for all the things that I can fault them with, they're a wonderful kind of siphon to get people into wargaming. Because people start with the Space Marines, they start with Warhammer 40K, but then a whole world opens up to them, because they're going to meet people who play historicals. They're going to meet people who play fantasy, that kind of thing. And so what Games Workshop does, even if they go about it in ways I don't always like, is they bring people into this wonderful hobby. And I really hope they're able to continue to do that, whether or not, whether or not they're, the final destination for people, or if people kind of spread their wings and discover like 100 other games out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suppose just to wrap that sort of angle up, I suppose you did mention, is it Total War, the computer game, which has
Yes,
been
yeah.
bringing folks in. So I suppose it's not all bad news with that side of things. If that's bringing people into it too.
Yeah, and I guess that's the other side of it, is if we see an expansion of the intellectual property stuff. So Games Workshops have been making Space Marine action figures and dolls and stuff, and I guess the more that it's out there, and the more that people can see it, only maybe like 1%, if that, of the people who would play Warhammer Total War would be interested in playing the tabletop version and spending the time to build those armies and paint them. But that being said, 1% of, a game that sold millions of copies, that's a pretty good player base. So yeah, it's a really interesting discussion to have, and it's not one that we can answer, but it's a really neat thing to watch.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's just all about indoctrinating the kids in our own life. So I've got the listeners maybe heard her, and I've mentioned her. It sounds like I always moan about my daughter, but she's 4 months old, and she was crying away downstairs. So we'll have to see when I could get her painting some stuff that isn't just the innards of her nappy. But I wanted to talk, Nath, a wee bit about well, aesthetics and units, I suppose. Aesthetic wise, do you think it's too wishful thinking to imagine that we might go back down that route of, the Monopoles Chaos Dwarfs and stuff like that? Do you think that's too out there?
I don't. I don't think it's too out there because of what I've seen happen to specifically Warhammer 40K over the last few years. Now, I'm not, and I've been talking a lot this episode about modern Games Workshop stuff, and I'm more of a casual observer at this point than I am a gamer or someone who really gets involved with modern Warhammer. But what is interesting is over the last few years, you've seen influences come back from the 90s era. So that wonderful second ed Warhammer 40K that was weird and wacky and wonderful. You're starting to see reintroduction of characters from that era. You're starting to see certain things get a little bit less grimdark, quite frankly, as far as tone, colors. And there's been this odd blend. Now, of course, modern 40K is its own beast, but a lot of its influences are drawn from second edition. And the reason I think it was is I think you had guys who grew up, say in the 90s, say they were like teens, that kind of thing. They stay interested. They love second ed 40K the way I love fifth edition fantasy. And eventually, they go down the games design route and they work for Games Workshop, and eventually they become the guys kind of moving the game forward, and they start to bring in some of those wonderful aesthetics that had fallen by the wayside during the 1998 reboot and subsequent editions. So I don't see why that couldn't happen for Warhammer Fantasy. And for some of the factions, of course, everything's remarkably consistent. So, a Skaven in Hero Hammer looks a lot like a Skaven in Age of Sigmar. The technology's better, the sculpts are a little bit more clear, but they share the basics. Orcs, of course. And then you've got stuff like Chaos Dwarves who changed so radically. Or, for example, Wood Elves were another one who went through a really interesting arc of changes. Ogres, of course, look entirely different from their 90s counterparts. But I think that and we'll see when this comes out, but I am willing to bet that there's enough people at Games Workshop and in positions at the company that grew up during that era and have those kind of feelings for that era, that you're going to start to see some of that slip back in. Because not only are these iconic aesthetics that old guys love, these are aesthetics that Games Workshop has started to swing back to. So during the 6th edition era, around 2000, when Warhammer Fantasy had its big kind of grimdark reboot, it followed 40K, everything got a little bit more toned down. So the unit I love to mention for this is Graveguard, or Whites, as they were in 4th ed. So they had... The 4th ed models were wildly fun. They had big bat-winged helms. They had giant halberds. They had very ornate armor. And it didn't make a lick of sense, of course, that these guys would have been buried in these things. But then the Graveguard that came back in 6th edition were a lot more uniform. They were cleaner. Like they looked more like regular soldiers rather than heroes. And you're just like, okay, like, yeah, these were like guys buried in a barrow with their king. I get it. But then that pendulum started to swing again. So you're seeing wild stuff out of Age of Sigmar. I think Age of Sigmar is knocking it out of the park with becoming its own thing, which it arguably always should have been. But that pendulum, Games Workshop is starting to be willing to just make stuff because it's crazy and it's fun and it's cool again. And I really think we could get that with Warhammer Fantasy. I think whenever we see the old world, it's going to have influences from that Hero Hammer era, maybe those 3rd ed influences. I don't know if you follow Age of Sigmar at all, but the orcs that came in the newest starter set took a lot of their design cues from some of the orcs from 3rd edition. which I thought was very cool. Kind of a neat homage, despite being a very, very different thing. So yeah, to answer that, I really do have some hope that we're gonna see some really inspired stuff come out whenever it does.
Point about the fact that it's, this stuff doesn't exist in a vacuum. You've got people that grew up with it that are working in there, and that's a great sign. And then there's also, the more cynical but still maybe beneficial aspect that the marketing team at GW must look at eBay and see the price of Chaos Dwarfs and stuff, and they're not making a penny from that. So they must be thinking, we could be making a ton of money out of this. And that's not necessarily a noble thought, but if it gets these great products back on the shelves, then
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that can't have escaped their notice, right? That the secondary market is absolutely wild and has been now for at least a couple of years. Although Chaos Dwarfs, I mean, I've been on the lookout for them for probably a better part of a decade now, and I don't think they've ever been what I would call affordable. I've never been able to push that button finally and make a purchase on them. What I wonder about, and this is something that maybe you've got an opinion on, the onset of 3D printing as a legitimate means to get miniatures now, right? We've had 3D printing for the better part of a decade, but now the quality is so good. It's so good. And there are great sculptors out there that have taken things like the classic 4th Ed Chaos Dwarfs, made facsimiles of those, and have been selling those. And I just wonder if Games Workshop comes out and they come out and say they do make the classic 4th Ed Chaos Dwarfs, and they're $70 for 10 or whatever. Do they sell what they're looking to sell? Or because this, we're the fantasy market isn't the 40K market. And what I mean by that is the people who are in it today tend to be older. They tend to have been around the block as far as Games Workshop goes. We know the score with Games Workshop, right? We're not the bright-eyed, bushy-tailed kids that are coming in buying their first box of Space Marines. If we've got options that are available now, accessible now, and we can either print them ourselves or have them printed for us, and these are the designs that we've always wanted anyway, what can Games Workshop do to convince us to buy their stuff instead of create our own? Because we have the means of production now, and I don't know what that means for a game that's just trying to find its footing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anything that's surprised you so far? I know we've talked about a lot of the negatives of that, but anything that's come out so far that you've thought, that's pretty cool?
Honestly, almost everything. I here's the thing is I sound negative because my brain thinks of all the problems that could come about. I am tremendously excited to see what happens. So the Kislev stuff, the very first stuff they showed us, they had the Ice Queen's personal bodyguard that looked incredible. They showed us some pictures of bears for bear cavalry, and if you don't want bear cavalry, you're lying. That's it. That's the only option. I am very excited about everything. One of the things that I'm most excited about, and it's probably the nerdiest thing, I just love that map that they've been filling in for the old world. I can't get enough of it. I love just poring over it, just looking at the various locations, trying to figure out what's different between the maps of kind of 25, I think 02 or 2520 that we got in the army books in 8th edition, and comparing those to what is in kind of 300 years previous to that. I think it's wildly interesting, and seeing the little tidbits, the breadcrumbs that they're leaving for us. So seeing wood elves outside of Athel and seeing them in the Forest of Arden. Well, what are they doing there? Is that a full community? There's another one kind of in Nordland in the Empire. Just thinking, oh, well, wouldn't that be interesting? What would the forest spirits look like if they were, kind of in a northern forest? Would you get like some pine tree treatment or something? I don't need, and this kind of goes back to my first point, is I need so little to get me excited about this game. I want so desperately to just nerd out about this entire thing until it's released. And yeah, so just little stuff like that. So one of the things that we saw recently, because the map that they're making keeps expanding, and originally I thought it was going to be just the little bit of the old world. And then it's expanded and expanded and expanded, and now we're kind of pushing into the Darklands on one side, and then kind of down towards the Southlands on the bottom. And so starting to see those first markings for the Chaos Dwarfs, and thinking, oh, like, is that? Are you telling me that I might get some Chaos Dwarfs Games Workshop? Because oh boy, like that's what gets me excited. That's what gets me going. So yeah, I honestly, everything that they have put out, I have found some, even the well overdue little clarification about what the game would be. I found a lot there to like. I really did, and I still find a lot to like in all of this stuff.
I don't know a huge amount about it, but I think one of the wee bits and pieces that I saw so far was about the border princes. And correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan, but it looks like you've got the scope to do a bit of your own world building with these areas, because nobody really knows what's going on, and you can have your own little lord or prince or whatever.
That's the real beauty of the border princes. And that was always the thing in Warhammer Fantasy, but they were never explored to their true potential. And even this snapshot that they gave us, they told us specifically, this is just a snapshot of what the Border Princes would look like in a given year. So you really have so much freedom to work with. And one of the neat little things that they did that I don't know that everybody kind of noticed right away was, you have symbols that demarcate these kingdoms, and some of them are very recognizable. You're just like, oh, okay, like, so this is a kingdom that is an offshoot of a Bretonian knight or something, or maybe a banished duke, because it's got those kind of Bretonian motifs. And here's one from the Empire, and then you start looking, and you're just like, oh, like this one's called Harkon, and it's like it's a bloody, a blood drop with a cup, and you're just like, oh, what would a vampire count border prince kingdom look like? And then you see another one that is reminiscent of an elven sigil, and you're just like, oh, like an interesting little elven nation, that kind of thing. And yeah, the border princes are, if you take a look at the rest of the rest of the Warhammer world, and you're just like, nah, I kind of want to do my own thing, that gives you full license to make something that is completely unique and completely lore friendly. Because the Border Princes are this wondrous, almost near lawless expanse of feuding petty kingdoms and lords on the upswing or the downswing. There's infinite possibilities there, and it's a nice space to have that is so close to the major kind of action points in the Warhammer world, because then it gives you those, if when you play a game, if you're a weirdo like me and you have to kind of make a whole story to go with it, I can't just sit down and play a game. I have to know why everyone's there and what they're doing. It gives you that ease of saying, well, my Border Prince army is marched southwards, we're going to plunder some of the Tomb King's pyramids or something, right? Like, it gives you that. And it's a region that I think a lot of people are going to have a lot of fun designing either mercenary forces for, or their own takes on Bretonian or Elven or Empire forces.
Want to just swing back around to your new job as overseer, because I want to make sure we'd covered your full agenda on that front. Was there anything else you felt was quite pressing on your to-do list?
You know what? One thing with if I was the old world designer, I think one of the things that I would put my foot down on, and you kind of mentioned it with like the return of like Monopoles models, but modern Games Workshop, they've really embraced this called 3 ways to play. And for 40K and for Age of Sigmar, they divided into open, which is just put whatever you want on the table and roll dice. Narrative, which is scenario play, and matched, which is either your tournament or your pickup game. I like that idea, but I think they've gone about this 3 ways to play the wrong way. Because what I see is the possibility of having a single game scratch kind of multiple itches. So not just like the narrative itch or the match play itch. Like I play points for all my games, but I would describe them all as narrative games still. What I would do is have 3 ways to play, one called Mighty Empires, one called something like Warhammer Classic, and the other one called Path to Glory. And the way it would work is Path to Glory is your skirmish option. It is Warhammer Skirmish. And you've got your little war band. You have ways to make them stronger. If you want to go with the chaos theme, like the original Path to Glory, I'm super cool with that. But basically, it is your entry point. You have super customizable. Everybody's got their weapon. Old school kind of Mordheim feel. The Warhammer Classic is what we all know and love. 1,000 to 2,000 points. You've probably got anywhere from 35 to 100 troops on the battle or on the field. And the last one would be my version, because I know there's so many people out there that loved 8th edition. And those big blocks of troops, right? They fell in love with the giant, the spectacle of it. And that's not my jam, but I understand that it's an important part of the community. I would want to go with like a 6th edition core for this old world. But what I would do is have a separate game type called Mighty Empires that would be basically apocalypse level Warhammer. So if you want to throw down with like 200 models, regiments of 40 to 60 night goblins or whatever, this is your space. And I would streamline it kind of like Kings of War, where you're moving whole regiments and you're fighting as regiments instead of removing certain models, that kind of thing. I think if Games Workshop embraced the fact that in modern war games, there's so many out there now that are miniatures agnostic. So I can take my Warhammer miniatures. I can play Kings of War. I can play Frostgrave. I can play any number of things. But do that as this is Warhammer in these 3 ways. And you can do all of them, and you can do them all with the same models. And to that point, I think one of the things that you must do if and I don't care if they're taking my advice here or not, but one of the things that they absolutely must do is bring back Monopoles unit filler troops. So you remember the old plastics from like the old plastic Chaos Dwarfs. There used to be ones for pretty much every army, at least a couple of ways. Old Empire halberdiers, and they filled out your back ranks. And then you bought some command models, and you made your unit. We need that. We need that desperately, because I am sure that one of the ways that Games Workshop made sure that 8th edition fantasy failed was making it so inaccessibly expensive to build out big units and to get that spectacle, right? Because that's what a lot of people want. And that's, I think, where you need to give us the unit filler. Give us the guys that are all holding their axes the same way. I love those guys. I love Monopoles plastics from that era. I enjoyed the ones that they made even later on. That was kind of what I wanted to mention there in the if I was the overlord of the old world. That's kind of what I would do, because I think there's room for everyone. In terms of, what was your favorite edition of Warhammer Fantasy? I think we can all get some amount of joy out of this old world project, but I think it requires them to make it almost into a couple of different games, or at least give us a couple of different game modes in which to play.
Yeah, it's a great point. I'm the same, Nathan. I love the Monopoles, and I don't know if that's just nostalgia speaking, but I think there's a pragmatic benefit of the Monopoles too, because if I think back to, I used to pick up miniatures. We went down on holiday to England. It wasn't a Games Workshop, but it was like a Toy Master shop, and they had the small Games Workshop area. So me and my brother would pick up, we had Plague Marines, we had High Elves, we had Chaos Dwarves, and we could get, we're kids at the time, we could get the box open and you could have the miniatures lined up on the table and you're just kind of, messing about with them, not playing an actual game with them or that. But these days, I've mentioned on the show before, I bought some skeletons and some marauders at the modern Games Workshop range, and they're fantastic miniatures. But you open them and it's just arms, legs, heads,
Yeah.
And as a kid, we want to instill in them the patience and the slowness of the hobby, but you can only do that so much. If you're opening that and saying, right, 2 weeks to scrape all the flash off these. Whereas you open the Monopoles, you can just break them off the sprues and stick them in the base, and there they are. There's your model. So it's that. It's more instant gratification without it being internet instant gratification, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you've made a fantastic point there. And it goes back to that accessibility, right? That's how you get kids. I wasn't, as a 9-year-old, I wasn't patient enough to do big models yet. Like I got a Keeper of Secrets, one of the old ones that would fit in the blister, and it took me forever to get that together. And it was like 6 pieces, but it was big and it was metal, and I didn't know how to work with it. But yeah, those Monopoles, those early Saurus, where you're the only option was, were they going to hold their arms slightly up or slightly down? That was it. But I got those on the table and I could start playing with them. And that's what you got to remember, is that not everyone is going to, if you're going for kids, which I think you absolutely need to, you got to remember that they're going to play with them like toys. They might play with them properly at some points, but they're also just going to put them on the table and like make up little games where they fight. and that's necessary. I'm not saying ditch the multi-pose kits, have a couple of options for each army. Things like, say, if it was dwarves for the army, I would have dwarf warriors and I would have the quarrelers, the crossbowmen. And I would make sure that those models were either 1 or 2 pieces. You get them out, you put them on the base. And if people want the multi-pose ones, you've got the multi-pose kits available. But make it so that we can have these things, and make it so that people can build an army, a decent sized army for a decent price, and make sure that you're not ignoring the young part of the hobby. And I think you can't go wrong with that.
Yeah, I was just thinking, what would be the stupidest model or races or units to be Monopoles? Imagine Snotlings or zombies. Imagine them all regimented. How funny that would be. No, I take it they did. They never did Monopose zombies back in the day, did they?
No, we got the metal ones, and then I think in 98 or 99 we got those multi-part that lasted for like 25 years or something. Yeah, there's some models that have always kind of just been only the metal or multi-pose, and then there was some that we got 1 or more different monopose kits for it. But
I think my first ever multi-pose were the skeletons. I don't have them anymore. I sold them, frustratingly, but putting them together, that was a lot of fun, because I'd been in the hobby a few years by then, so I kind of knew what I was doing. But if that was the first unit that I'd bought, it would have been more frustrating than anything else, because I just wanted to rip that cellophane off, open the box, and just see everything there. It's ready to go almost. So
yeah. And when you think about those early days kits, and especially the starters, what concerns me about the starters is that when you look at them nowadays, those sprues are not super simple. Like, the models go together well and they snap together, and the technology to have them and hide the seams and everything is incredible. But you still, when you open the box, you see a jumble of plastic. Whereas when I opened the box, when I got my 5th edition starter set, I saw knights, I saw lizard men. I maybe had to put arms on, and I stuck the knights on their horses, but it was there and my brain could make sense of it. I look at something today like the Age of Sigmar starter set, and some of the models are absolutely incredible, but they're 5-6 pieces, and yes, they snap together. But again, if you're looking to get kids into the hobby, that's asking a lot sometimes. And I feel like we ignore that as adults. And I feel like Games Workshop ignores that as well, that, not everyone's got these skills and not everyone wants to do that. Sometimes just give people toys to play with, and then if they paint them and if they play the game that you've made with them, great. But if not, then you know what? They still bought them.
Yeah, it reminds me, I wish I could recall who said this, but I'm sure it was a guest on Dan's Paint All the Minis podcast, a game designer on there. They were talking about what they call the Christmas Day test, when they're looking at planning a game. It's, can this box be opened? Can it be assembled? And can you sit with a kid and hold their attention and play through a game of it on Christmas Day with all this other, all the other presents that they might have got, a new phone, an Xbox, whatever. So it's a good way of looking at it.
That should be by law what they have to do when designing boxes like that, especially like the starter set, the introductory set. That is the best thing I've ever heard. Yeah, that is the ultimate test.
And bring back that Monopoles Chaos Warrior that, like you were talking about, that wee paint set. Frustratingly, those paint sets, they never had flesh colours in them. It was like a red, a green, a black, a white.
Yeah. They would show you they'd show you the miniature that they had painted, and you're just like, I don't know if you've given me all the colors for this at all.
I found some of my first ever Battlemaster stuff, and I've got like a green Beastman and stuff like that. Like, I don't have the colors. High Elf skin, it was like yellow. So So Nathan, we're coming to the end of our episode here. It's been really good fun. What's been the latest goings on in the Orchard podcast and your sort of hobby stuff?
Well, my hobby's kind of taken a little bit of a break. I did a little bit over the kind of Christmas 2 weeks. I've actually gone back to school, so I'm doing a radio television journalism program, and that has been just eating up all my time. So not too much as far as hobby goes. I painted a few single miniatures here or there. More so on the orchard side of things, we've been really busy. I was originally going to step back the podcast while I went to school, and then realized that I just didn't have the heart to do it. I just love it too much. So I've been doing a lot of stuff. We did a fun 7-part retrospective on Storm of Chaos, which was meant to be a 2-part retrospective, and things just got out of hand. The latest episode, I did a little holiday story from the 5th edition Bretonnian book, the story of Tybalt, who is a knight errant looking for his lost brother. All sorts of stuff. It's the usual, just Warhammer variety, whatever pops into my head on the Orchard. So yeah, lots of fun. I'm actually looking at I've recorded some video, hopefully gonna have that up on YouTube soon. It's been something that I've been meaning to get into for a while now, but just time and skill, and my skill's starting to improve with this program that I'm doing. So it's just finding the time to make some silly Warhammer videos about the kind of lost units that got dropped between editions. But yeah, that's where I'm at. If anyone wants to check it out, it's the War Games Orchard. You find that anywhere that you find podcasts, basically.
Thanks once again to Nathan for coming on the show. It's always a real pleasure to speak to him, and I'm sure we'll do a few more episodes together in future too. One more wee thing before you go. I'm running a tabletop miniature hobbyist survey over at bedroombattlefields.com/survey, and I'd hugely appreciate it if you could take a couple of minutes to nip over there and answer some questions about your own hobby life and opinions. Again, you'll find it at bedroombattlefields.com/survey. I can't say too much about it at this moment in time, but there's a potential for some cool opportunities for the folks who get involved. It'll also really help with the running of this podcast too, so a couple of minutes of your time would be massively appreciated. Once more, that's bedroombattlefields.com/survey. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll speak again on the next episode.